So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday, traditionally the most tired day of the week. Is that what today is? Kind of like, oh, it's not Friday, but we've been in school like all week. Did it go by so fast? Is it going by so fast? Is it quick? Yeah. Okay, so we have a bit of a light turnout this morning, but I guess that's all right. What we'll do is we will talk about what we talked about yesterday with the two articles and Trump and whether he's a fascist or not, or should we see him that way. I'll give you a few more sort of tips and hints and things about paper writing and paper, how to go about your paper. Good morning, come on in. And then if there's some time left, I think what I'll do is I'll give you some time in class to work on it, which I think is nice, right? So that's what we'll do. We'll recap from yesterday. I'll talk a little bit more about paper and structure and writing and stuff like that, and then I'll give you some time to write on to work on your own stuff, okay? Oh, and I should probably say good morning to our online people who are here. So Kevin is here. Good morning, Kevin. Rafim is here. Good morning to you. Ananda is here. Good morning. And Shania is here. Good morning, Shania. And Ayushi is here. Good morning. Good morning to you, Ayushi. Okay. So yesterday, Aunt Ryan is here too. Good morning to you. So I prefaced this whole thing by we read a little, I don't even know if it was a biography, but a little blurb on Benito Mussolini, and I suggested that, this guy sounds a little bit familiar, this sort of charismatic speaker with an acting background, with no strong ideology, and just kind of says whatever he wants, and sort of revs up the masses with his, with the things he says, and of course, has very authoritarian tendencies. And of course, Benito Mussolini is able to take those authoritarian tendencies and make them real, because he actually manages to have himself installed as a dictator of Italy. Donald Trump, of course, has not managed to do that. Unfortunately for him, and fortunately for the rest of us, the US has some reasonably strong checks on presidential power. But of course, we definitely see Donald Trump testing the bars, right, to see if he can actually do what he wants to do, right? And he's, to be honest, he's gotten away with quite a bit so far, right? He's managed to be impeached, but not kicked out of office. He's managed to violate conflict of interest. He has pardoned his friends, and who knows what else, right? He's managed to do as much as a president can within the law, right? But of course, I guess we'll see how that plays out in November during the election. But anyway, and there's more people here too. So Mike is here. Good morning, Mike. And Hadil is here. Good morning. And I think that's Ty, maybe. Good morning. And Helen's here too. Good morning, Helen. Right, so the question was, should we see him as a fascist or not? And so we read two articles, and Michaela's here too. Good morning, Michaela. We read two articles, one saying that yes, we should think of him as a fascist, one article saying no, he should not be seen as a fascist. Summarize the first one for me. Why should we see Trump as a fascist? What was that article arguing? He undermines democracy. Okay, so in theory, a non-fascist would be for democracy, but Donald Trump attempts to undermine democracy. How does he do that? How's he doing it right now? Because he is.
I think this has to do with the violence.
Yeah, he's trying to. Right now, it's not in the article because these articles are from a couple years ago. But right now, he's trying to undermine people's faith in the electoral system, right? He's trying to claim that the election is rigged, that these mail-in ballots are somehow fraudulent or will lead to voter fraud somehow. He's kind of, yeah, he's stoking fears that the election will be invalid, right? And of course, the election's the most, well, not the most important part, but one of the most important parts of a democracy, because in a democracy like ours and in the United States, that's really the only time that you get to have your say, right? Most of the time we don't vote on anything individually. Sometimes we do, but most of the time our only chance to voice our opinion in a strong way is by voting. And if Donald Trump takes that away and creates a situation where nobody believes in the election anymore, then do you have a democracy? No, you have something else, right? You don't have your democracy anymore. So right now, he's trying to undermine democracy by undermining people's faith in the election. In the article, they were talking about he had poisoned the well of public discourse, right? So he had he spreads conspiracy theories. He makes accusations at people. He tweets all the time and says angry things and lies all the time. And so it becomes hard to have a public, intelligent conversation about anything when nobody can agree on the facts, when people take lies as the truth, and when there's conspiracy theories that the president himself is spreading around, right? It becomes impossible to have sort of a legitimate, honest, real discussion because there's so much sort of garbage swirling around in the air, right? What else? Why else should we see him as a fascist?
The fact that he separated children from their families.
And the camps thing, right? So he seems to have no issue putting people into camps and of course separating the children out from their parents, which was an awful thing to do. And so this use of camps was compared to other fascists that we may know. Although we should probably say that in Canada and the US during both the First and Second World War, both of those countries used internment camps for potential enemies of the state. And so one of the more famous ones here in Canada were Japanese citizens of Canada who were, during the Second World War, were rounded up and sent to a camp in the interior of British Columbia. So, democracies are no stranger to using camps either. Of course, they're not equivalent to a concentration camp or a death camp in Nazi Germany, but democracies have used camps as well. Why else should we see him as a fascist? Right. He has kind of outed himself as kind of not approving of diversity, right? So he mocked a disabled reporter. He said a lot of racist and sexist things, right? So he's not for diversity, he's not for diversity and equality. He seems to be against it. He seems to be against democracy. Anything else? Why we should see him as a fascist? What do you think, Aliana? Or are you still doing your math?
I don't know if this has been said, but he has poisoned the well of public discourse.
Mm-hmm.
The values of decency create.
We did say that.
And borrows the way in which free fascists.
And what?
He borrows the ways in which free fascists think and live.
Well, yeah, I think that's kind of what we're arguing, right? Is that he's taken a lot of pages from the way a fascist thinks a country should run, right? And so maybe we should think of him as a fascist, even though, there are things that a fascist would normally do that so far Donald Trump has been unsuccessful in doing because, of course, the U.S. seems to be a very strong democratic state, but again, he's definitely testing the boundaries of that. What do you think? You're smiling as if you're having a thought.
Yeah, we said the F word.
Who did?
You did.
I said what?
Fascist?
Yeah. Oh, I said, oh yeah, and that always makes you, sorry. Okay. I just saw you smile and I thought, oh, he's having a thought, but I guess your thought was, ooh, fascism. Okay. Why should we not think of him as a fascist? What was the argument in the second? And I know the second paper was not as strongly argued as the first one. And in fact, I think most of us were kind of like, what is this? And that was a good reaction because, again, it's not a very well-made argument at all. And so it's good that we see that, you know, not all arguments are perfectly put together. This one certainly isn't, but what was that person trying to argue?
He didn't judge his opponents.
Right, so fascists, when they get into power, usually they purge their opponents, right? Whether they put them in jail, they might execute them, they might exile them to Siberia, whatever it might be, they get rid of all the opposition. But did Donald Trump do that? No, he didn't do that, right? Therefore, no fascist. Okay?
I got this one from the first article.
Okay.
He has no armed squads, youth movement, or a one-party state.
He has what?
No armed squads, youth movement, or a one-party.
Right. So usually fascists have some sort of paramilitary group behind them, right? And so Hitler, before he comes to power, has his brown shirts, right, which are they become the SS later on. They're a bunch of armed, violent thugs who go around and do Hitler's bidding, right? And Mussolini has a bunch of these guys as well. I don't know if they're the black shirts or what they're called. I kind of forget. But what's that? Are they orange? No. Mussolini has a group of these too. But does Trump have a group of violent thugs who go around and beat up people who are against Trump? No. Yet. Yeah. So, but it's interesting how we can almost imagine this kind of thing occurring, right? So, yeah, he doesn't have kind of a brown shirts or a group of violent thugs. Therefore, not a fascist, says the article, right? Another thing. Right. So the point there is that can a fascist come to power in democracy? What's that? All the time, we said. But of course, this author is making the claim that, well, how can you have a fascist in a democratic state? Fascists are anti-democracy. Therefore, he can't be a fascist. But again, that's a premise, but it's a false one, right? Because we know that that's exactly how fascists come to power. They come to power in democracies. That's how it happens. They don't like democracy, but they often find their way into politics through it. And in fact, there's a quote from Hitler where Hitler tries to overthrow the state, right? We'll get to this later, but there's the Munich Putsch or the beer hall putsch. He tries to overthrow the government. Doesn't work. They're not very well organized. I think they're a little drunk because they got their plan together at a beer hall. It doesn't work at all. Hitler gets arrested and he goes to jail. And so when he gets out of jail, he says to his Nazi party, he says, okay, we shall have to hold our nose and, participate in democracy until we can gain power, right? So he's like, ooh, this democracy thing stinks, but we're going to go into it anyway because that's how we're going to get power. So, yeah, fascists come to power through democracy all the time, even if they don't necessarily believe in it. So, again, that author has used this premise to support their argument, but it's false. It's not true. It's not a very good premise. Okay, so we have two kind of sides to our story. And so you'll recall that in this paper, I am asking you to argue one way or the other. Okay, so should Donald Trump be seen as a fascist or should he not be seen as a fascist? Now, it doesn't really matter which argument you pick. Okay, I'm I'm not pulling for one side or the other here. But what I do want to see you do is answer the question and logically support it, right? So I want to see you using the historical data that we have and any you might find and using it to kind of argue your case one way or the other. And so, again, I want you to construct a good argument. I want you to use factual information, and I want you to use that information correctly. Again, I'm not too interested in whether you argue that he is or isn't. I just want to see you do a convincing job of explaining your position. Okay? So I said, how should you go about writing this? So I said, first we should read the articles and that I provided you and understand them. And I think we've done that. I want you to create your argument and use it to structure your paper, and I'll do that a little bit later, okay? I'll show you how to do that. I want you to find one more credible article that you can use to add to your position, okay? So just to make the papers a little bit different, everyone will have a third source that will, as I say, make the papers a little more interesting because we're all using the same two. So again, you'll have to find an appropriate article and figure out what that person is arguing as well, okay? Yeah, short introduction and conclusion, and cite your sources, okay? So the first part, in finding a third source, we want to make sure that any source we use is credible, right? So a source that we can believe, a source that we can feel comfortable that the information is factual and true, and that the person actually has some idea of what they're talking about, right? And this is important too because there's a lot of information out there. A lot of it is good, a lot of it is questionable, so we need to be able to choose carefully in terms of what information we read. And so I'll give you kind of two paths, okay? So the first path is you can go through the college library, okay? And so college library, if you go through it, most of the stuff in there is, for our purposes, is credible, okay? So if you find something through the college library, it's probably pretty decent, okay? And the reason it's decent is because most of the stuff in the college library has been published, right? Like either in a journal or in a book, and even if it's an electronic source, someone has looked at it, right? So if it's in a journal or a magazine, some editor or publisher has read the article and said, okay, this is legitimate, it's factual, it's well written, right? Somebody has looked it over. You cannot say that of, Bob's webpage where he writes it from his basement, right? Like nobody has ever read that. Bob can type whatever he wants, whether it's true or false or ridiculous or, that lizard people are in charge of the government or something. People write all kinds of things and they're not true, right? So if you go through the college website or the college library, you can be pretty confident that anything you find will be legitimate for our purposes anyway, okay? So you'd go through the library here. I've got a little arrow. And then you would go to find materials just like that. And then you would go to databases just like that, A to Z. And then you'll have a list of different databases to look in. You can look in any of them, any which one you like. MAS Ultra might be the best one for this class, although I think there's a Britannica Online encyclopedia, which might help you as well. And yeah, so you just select it, and then you can type in your search terms. So you might type in fascism and Trump, or fascist and Trump, and see what comes up, right? See what kind of articles come up, and see if one of those might suit your paper, okay? So again, you can do that. You can go through the library website, and most of the stuff you find there will be credible, okay? Now, oh yeah, and you might want to check these off too on the side. So I usually check off full text because I want to read the whole thing, and I usually just check off magazines and newspapers, okay? So you don't want book reviews because those are reviews of books, right? I read this person's book and this is what I think of it. We don't care about that. That's no good. What else is there's some primary sources, which again, you might want to use for other assignments, but we won't use this time. And what else have I not checked off there? Biographies, no, probably not. So I usually just check off magazines and newspapers in this one, and it just gives us what we want, okay? Now, if you go out onto the internet, which lots of us like to do, and you just want to Google things, you can do that too, but again, you have to be a little more careful because the internet is the wild west of written words and anything goes out there, right? So you could find something that's very credible and factual and carefully researched, or you can find a pile of garbage, right? And anywhere in between. So we've got to ask ourselves some questions. And so here's what I'd like you to try to pay attention to. And there's a lot here, but I just want to give you maybe the broad points. So if you're looking at an online source, so if you Google Trump and fascist and you come across an article, have a look at how it is written, okay? So again, if you see grammar or spelling errors, or if you find it's not written in a very kind of clear way, that's a red flag, right? Most stuff that is authoritative is actually well written. And so if the writing style is bad, probably the analysis and the facts are bad too. And in fact, I have a heavy bias this way. If I'm reading something and I see like a grammar mistake or a spelling mistake, their credibility just drops down a huge amount as soon as I see it, because I'm like, ugh, they don't know what they're talking about. Even though, of course, I make grammatical mistakes all the time, but as soon as I see that, I think, ugh, they don't know. They don't know what they're talking about. Author, try to figure out who the author is, okay? So most sources that are legitimate and authoritative, people actually put their name on them. And you should be able to Google the person and figure out who they are, right? So if you Google someone and you're like, oh, they're a history professor at UBC, that's good. If you Google them and you cannot find any mention of them, then that's not so good, right? Who are they? How do we know that they know what they're talking about? We don't, right? So some articles will not have any author at all. So if you look at an encyclopedia, sometimes there's no author listed, and that's okay. Or sometimes you'll see editorials that are, like the Globe and Mail will have an editorial from the Globe. And so I think it'll kind of be written by a group of writers. And so sometimes they won't have a name on it either. But for the most part, articles that are credible have someone's name associated with them, right? Is that cool so far? Okay. Have a look at currency, okay? So this is not always important, but sometimes it is. So is your source reasonably recent, or is it 50 or 60 years old? Because times change, information changes, ways of looking at things change, and so sometimes you want things that are a little more current, right? Although sometimes not. Sometimes you'll need an older source, but I would look for something newer, especially if you're talking about Trump. You're probably going to be looking at something within the last 4 years, right? So if you're doing that MAS Ultra search, you can filter it for a date as well, and then you won't see anything before 2016, which is maybe what you want, maybe. Fairness. So content is balanced, presenting all sides of an issue and multiple points of view. Now this is a tricky one, because in a paper where you're trying to argue something, there is bias, right? The author wants you to believe one thing or another. The question is it a legitimate argument? So the first paper that we read that said Donald Trump is a fascist, there was bias there, right? He wasn't trying to be entirely fair, right? He wasn't trying to present all sides. He was simply saying, I think this dude's a fascist, and here is why, right? And so fairness has its boundaries, right? It's okay to take a side, but would you say that the second article we read was equally fair? No, right? There was a pretty clear pro-Trump bias there. And we could see it because the argument wasn't very good. And he was kind of, the author was not really, not making a very good argument. And so, but we could see even though his argument was weak, he was still letting Trump off the hook anyway. And so that one I would say is a little less fair in that it was more biased. But again, just because an article doesn't, you know, just because an article doesn't say, well, maybe he is and maybe he isn't, who knows? I mean, I guess that's fair, but it doesn't really take a stand. And so often articles do take a stand. They want to convince you of something, and that's okay. That's why we look at the argument to see if it is a good argument or not, right? The last one here is relevance. So is it relevant to your topic or research, right? And so if you were talking about fascism and Trump and you came up with an article on Hitler, it's like, okay, but is that really, you know, is that really entirely relevant in this case, right? And it might be, but it also might not be. And so you have to be kind of careful and make sure that the thing that you're talking about is the thing that your article is talking about as well, okay? So, ooh, lots of messages. So I would say, you know, pay attention to where your source comes from. Also, look at the website. It doesn't say here because it's not tuned for the internet, but also look at the website design value as well. So usually legitimate sources have nice websites, right? They're formatted well. You can tell that they pay someone to create their website. That's usually at least a good sign, right? If it looks like somebody, you know, if it's a Weebly website that somebody has created on their own, maybe not so much, right? Although, if it's a history professor from Harvard who's created his own Weebly site, then that's okay, right? So you've got to kind of weigh these things and say, you know, would I buy a car from this person, right? Do I trust this person to tell me the truth, or do I not, right? So we have to be a little skeptical, right? We have to say, do I believe this person? Do I trust them, or do I not trust them, okay? I want to talk a little bit about plagiarism because I had a few instances of it last term, and I usually don't, but because we're doing more writing, because we're online, I thought I would talk about it a little bit, okay? Plagiarism is kind of the cardinal sin of academia. Why do you think that is? Why is the first commandment of academia, thou shalt not plagiarize? Why do you think? It's true, you're stealing another person's info, but why is that such a bad thing? It means you're not working hard. Maybe. It's what?
Taking someone else's credit.
And why is that so bad, do you think?
Because you don't do anything. You don't learn anything. You just copy.
Okay, all true. Why else do you think? What to not give credit to someone else? Why might that be bad for everybody? Let's say I've done my research. I'm a cancer researcher. I've been working in the lab for years with test tubes and Bunsen burners and all kinds of things. And I have come up with the cure for cancer. Okay? I've cracked the code. I've done it. But if I'm not going to get any credit for it, do I want to share that idea? Maybe not so much, right? Maybe I keep it to myself, right? Or maybe I try to open a secret lab and then I just, people pay me millions of dollars and they come in and I secretly cure their cancer. But nobody ever finds out and I make millions of dollars. So in the way that science works is that we build on what other people have discovered, right? We build on the knowledge of the past. And so if people don't share what they know, then we can't really advance knowledge, right? So this thing here, my iPhone, This phone here is full of all kinds of technology that Apple did not invent, right? Some of it Apple did, but not all of it. Apple did not invent the microchip, right? Apple did not invent aluminum or glass, right? Apple did not invent electricity or LEDs, right? They didn't invent any of those things, but other people did, and they incorporated those discoveries into their own technology, which of course they're allowed to do. But if nobody else shared those discoveries and those techniques, would we have iPhones? No, right? So really no academic does all their own work. Everybody is kind of, have you ever heard of the expression standing on the shoulders of giants? Have you ever heard that one? Basically that's what people are doing, right? All this work has come before, and then you as a researcher take the next step, which is fine. That's what you're supposed to do, but you have to credit those who have come before you. And giving credit to people is kind of acknowledging their hard work, saying, thanks for that idea or thanks for that invention, and also encouraging people to share, right? So if people know they're going to get credit for something, they'll share it with everyone, and then we can actually move knowledge and science forward, right? And so that's why in academia, plagiarism is the capital crime, right? Because if people aren't given credit, then there's no reason for people to share their work. And if people don't share their work, we can't move knowledge ahead, right? The only way knowledge moves ahead is if people discover something and then they immediately get out there and say, hey, guess what I discovered? Blah, 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 right? And then everyone can use that information to move their own work ahead. So academia only works if people share their ideas, and people only share their ideas if you give credit to them, okay? And so that's why it's the cardinal sin. And of course, if you just copy and paste, you don't learn anything. That's true too. But the real reason I think is because that's how knowledge moves forward, right? So you can plagiarize if you use other people's ideas or words, and you pass them off as your own, or you don't credit the source they come from, okay? So this is a tricky thing to do, and are you with me there, Aliana and Rose? Okay, because this is important. Academics do this all the time, right? They borrow other people's ideas and work all the time. And that's okay, right? It's okay to use other people's ideas. You just have to credit them, that's all, okay? And so we need to know how to sort of treat that information in the text, in our writing, and then we need to know how and when to cite them, to reference them, okay? So if you're using other people's stuff, ideas or information in your writing, you can do it two ways. You can either paraphrase or you can quote, okay? So what's paraphrasing, if I asked you? Yes, but almost. I'm going to change some of your words, but yes. What's that?
So already in your words.
Yeah, you're saying what other people have said, but you're saying it in your own words. And often you're saying it in a more concise way, right? So yeah, so you're giving your own version of the essential information that someone else has given you, okay? So I like paraphrasing much better than quoting, okay? Paraphrasing allows you to, when you're writing, you stay in your own voice, right? You're not using the voice of others, so you stay in your own voice. And again, that's what teachers and professors are looking for, right? They don't want to hear what other people have said. They want to hear what you say. And I am no different from that. I want to hear what you say. I don't want to hear, what this person said, and what this person said, and what this other person said. I don't want to hear any of that. I want to hear what you say. That's why we're here, right? So I much prefer people to paraphrase, okay? So have a look at these two examples, okay? So here we have an original piece of writing, and then underneath we have a paraphrase. And I'm sorry that my head is in the way there. So I believe this actually, students frequently overuse direct quotation in taking notes, and as a result, they overuse quotations in the final research paper. Probably only about 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter, and I would say in some cases even less than that. Therefore, you should strive to limit the amount of exact transcribing of source materials while taking notes. And so here we have a little source of where that comes from, writing research papers from 1976, wow, that's a long time ago, page 46 and 47, right? So we have that, we have a little citation there, we have it referenced of where it comes from, and we have some text. And here we have a quick paraphrase, right? This is what James Lester says, effectively. In research papers, students often quote excessively, failing to keep quoted materials to a desirable level. Since the problem usually originates during their note-taking, it is useful, I think it probably says, to minimize the material recorded verbatim, which is word for word, right? So they say basically the same thing, but somebody has written it in their own words. And so that's good, right? That's what you want to do. And they've cited it at the end, right? Lester 4647. So we know that idea that students often quote too much, and they often quote too much because they use too many quotes when they're taking notes before they even write their papers. That idea comes from James Lester. So here they've just cited it. So we know it's Lester's idea, right? Perfectly done. You can also summarize things even more briefly, and that's okay too, right? So depending on how much detail you want to go into, you can just say very quickly, students should take just a few notes in direct quotation to minimize the amount of quoted material. Super quick summary, that's basically what Lester says. And if that's all you want to say, if that's all that is useful for you, that's all you have to say. So that's the other thing, is that just because you have a whole article full of stuff doesn't mean you have to summarize every detail of it in your own writing, right? So for the second, let's say you were arguing in your paper, let's say you were arguing that Donald Trump is a fascist, okay? And you might just simply say, some people might claim that Donald Trump is not a fascist, and then reference the second article, right? Some people may claim that Donald Trump is not a fascist, reference to the second article. However, I believe that we should see him as a fascist, and here's why, right? So you don't have to go into that second paper's whole argument. You might just reference it and say, some people say this, like this dude over here, but I don't think so. And then you go into your own thing. So just because a source or an article has a lot of stuff in it, it doesn't mean you have to reference every single thing. You can just borrow the main idea and give a summary, right? And say, some people would argue that he isn't, but I think he is, right? So it's very simple. You don't have to, just because a source has a lot of information in it, doesn't mean that all of that information has to wind up in your own writing. You can just summarize the main idea, give a little thank you to that person, and then you move on, okay? All right, so here's a plagiarized version. So this is the same, the top one is the same thing that we just read about the note-taking and the quoting. And if you look at the bottom one, you'll see how close it is, right? So you see what they've done? They've kind of swapped out a few things, right? Students frequently, students often. Overuse, use too many. Direct quotations is the same. When they take notes, in taking notes. And as a result, they overuse, resulting in too many of them in the final research paper, right? So they've just swapped out a few words and said things just slightly differently. No good, right? So we don't want to do that. That's plagiarizing, okay? So what we saw earlier here, that's good, right? They said basically the same thing that James Lester was saying, but they said it in different words, they said it in a different order, they said it in a much shorter form, right? Here, we're just swapping out words, or maybe, you know, pulling out pulling out the thesaurus and using a synonym for something. Don't do that, right? So you want to say things in your own words, even if the idea is not yours, okay? Obviously, when you're quoting something, you're using exact words from somebody's writing or from somebody's mouth, right? So we've seen this before, I think on day 1 or day 2 of this class, the little part of the speech from Wilfrid Laurier where he says that this is the century of Canada and things are just going to go up and up and up and everything's going to be great. So yeah, if we want to use this, then we've got to quote it, right? And we've got to cite where it comes from. And we've got to make sure that the wording is exact, right? So if you quote something, the wording has to be exact, the punctuation has to be exact, the whole thing, right? You've got to get everything from the original source. But that said, I usually advise students to not quote anything at all. It's very tempting because it helps up your word count and you don't have to actually write anything. So I understand the temptation of throwing in a couple quotes to kind of pad out your writing and get you over the, you know, over the word limit or over the page limit or whatever. But usually I find that most of the time that students put a quote in, it doesn't add anything to what you're saying, right? It's like you're telling me a story, and then all of a sudden this voice comes in out of nowhere and says blah, 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 blah. And then the voice is gone. And then your story continues. And it's like, well, what was that other thing for, right? It didn't add anything to the story. And so for the most part, I would say if you can get away with not quoting, don't do it, right? It's not super useful in a paper like this. Maybe in an English essay where you might quote a couple of lines of a poem and then you might say that, you know, William Butler Yeats, when he says this, means this, right? So you might want to quote Yeats because those are the exact words that you're analyzing. But in a paper like this, it probably won't help you to quote, even though it's tempting to add it in because, again, it helps kind of make more of your writing, but I wouldn't do it if I were you. And again, this is a difficult skill to learn. And when I went to university, I did not know how to do this. And so the first paper I wrote in History 111, I think, got a solid 50%. And I'm pretty sure the prof was just being nice to me because he knew, because I definitely plagiarized it because I didn't know how not to. And he definitely realized that I didn't know what I was doing. And so that 50 was a bit of a gift from him. And he was like, by the way, you need to figure this out because you don't know what you're doing. But I'll give you a pass on this one because you're clueless and you're a first-year student, but you have to figure this out. And so I didn't know how to do it at the time, and it's a tricky skill. It's a tricky skill to learn. The other thing I'll say is that when you're trying to figure out what you should cite and what you shouldn't, that's tricky too. Because basically you want to cite stuff, you want to cite information and ideas that belong to certain people, but you don't want to cite information that everyone knows, okay? So Donald Trump is I might get the number wrong here. Donald Trump is the 46th president of the United States, period. Now, don't cite that. That's a well-established fact. Everybody knows it. That piece of knowledge doesn't belong to anyone. You know, don't cite it. There are 9 planets in the solar system. Actually, I don't know how many there are. There are 9 planets in the solar system. Don't cite it. That's commonly known. Everybody knows it. It's not a big deal, right? However, if you're citing somebody's scientific results, right? So if you have a scientific paper and you say, you know, the authors conclude that, you know, gravity moves in waves, you definitely want to cite that because that's discovered by them. That's kind of their idea or the result of their data. So that you need to cite because the idea is kind of theirs. But don't cite stuff that, you know, kind of everyone knows or is kind of established. You know, Earth only has 1 moon. Duh, don't cite it. We all know that to be the case, right? And again, sometimes that's difficult if you're working in a sort of an area that you don't fully know, right? So if you're working in sociology, if you're taking a sociology class or a psychology class, sometimes you don't know what everyone else knows and what everyone doesn't know, right? It's tough to know when to cite. And so you'll probably make a few mistakes there. And that's okay. Basically what I want to see you do is trying to do it right. And if you slip up a little bit, that's okay. You are going to make mistakes. You're going to not cite things correctly or cite something you don't need to. It's going to happen, okay? So I'm okay with that. I'm okay with mistakes in terms of citations and stuff like that, because you're still learning how to do it, and it's, quite frankly, it's not the easiest thing to do, especially if you're, say you're writing a history paper and you don't really know that much about history, or if you're writing a psychology paper and you don't really know that much about psychology yet. You're probably going to make a mistake. It's not a big deal to me. To some teachers it is. I'm going to say it's not. But, however, if you simply copy and paste stuff because you're trying to fool me, I guarantee you I will know, and I will give you a 0, because trying to figure out plagiarism is so frustrating. And I much prefer, it's much easier for me to read the paper that you've actually tried to write, and I will, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and sort of give you the best mark I can based on what you give me. But if somebody just copies and pastes and says, oh, maybe he won't figure it out, he'll figure it out. He's read a lot of student writing, and he knows when something is a little off. And so don't do it. I'm not marking stuff that's not yours. But again, if you're trying to cite properly and you fudge it up a little bit, that's okay. I expect you're going to make some mistakes. That is not a capital crime at this point. You're new to it. That's okay, right? You're learning. But if you try to fool me, I will probably be annoyed and I will give you a 0 for it. Okay? Cool? Okay. Do your best. Do your own work. And I will give you the best grade I can based on that. Okay? Okay, the last thing I'll say is about arguments. And so I want your paper to have an argument, right? I want you to argue a point. And again, it doesn't really matter if I agree with your point or not. What I'm looking for is you to build the argument properly and support it with some legitimate premises and information, right? Again, I'm not looking for your argument to be bulletproof. I'm not looking to agree or disagree with your argument. I just want to see you use historical data to construct your own ideas about whether Donald Trump should be seen as a fascist or should not, right? And maybe I'll throw in the fact that you might want to go at this at a slightly different angle and talk about consequences, right? And so, what are the consequences of not seeing Donald Trump as a fascist? Maybe whether he is or isn't the problem. Maybe it's that if we don't see him as a fascist, there will be a negative consequence for us later. Or maybe it doesn't matter, right? Maybe whether we see him as a fascist or not, it doesn't matter because he's an enemy of democracy, or he's just a bad president and we need to get rid of him, regardless of what label you want to put on him. I don't know. Maybe you want to argue something like that. But I do want you to have an argument. And so you'll remember my classic argument about coffee, that you should drink it because it's delicious and inexpensive and it helps you study and get better grades. This is a pretty simple argument, right? And we talked about it. We thought it was valid and logical. Sure, there were things that were missing. Sure, you could disagree with this argument, but we thought it was decent, right? Right? Decent argument? Okay. So I can very quickly and very easily, I could write a paper on this very quickly, right? So the question, just like the question I'm asking you, should we see Donald Trump as a fascist? Question, should students be drinking coffee? And so I could very quickly come up with a conclusion because my argument has one, which is kind of a thesis statement. I have a premise that coffee is delicious, and I said that I could come up with some evidence, right? We talked about that, did we not? Did we not? Yeah, we did. Same thing with coffee is inexpensive. I said that I could provide you with some evidence that it is inexpensive, probably. And I said that it'll help you study and get better grades. And we said I could probably come up with some evidence for that too, right? And maybe even, I think I added a premise here, maybe coffee is good for your health. Maybe I could find some scientific studies that say that it actually is, maybe. And so if I do that, I can create a very quick outline, right? So I'll have a brief introduction. Coffee has been consumed by people since 3,000 years ago or something. I don't know. I'd look it up, right? Some sort of introduction to the whole thing. And then, yeah, blah, blah, introductory stuff. We all have seen introductions. They're tricky to write, though. And then I have a thesis statement. All students should drink coffee because coffee is delicious, inexpensive, will help you get better grades, and is good for your health, right? So right in that thesis statement, I have my whole argument in my hand, right? So when somebody reads it, they immediately know what I'm going to argue and how I'm going to support it, right? The whole roadmap for the paper is right there in my thesis. And so, yeah, I'm going to have 4 paragraphs here, one for each premise. Whoops. One for each premise, right? So I've written a bit of a topic sentence here. Coffee is widely regarded as the world's most popular and delicious drinks. Blah, 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 right? So then I talk about how delicious coffee is and what's my evidence for saying that it's delicious. Same thing with the second one. Here's my topic sentence. In general, coffee can be seen as a relatively inexpensive beverage. Blah, blah, blah. And then I tell you, I prove to you how inexpensive it is. Same with the third one. A number of scientific studies have demonstrated that coffee can help students study and get better grades. In a recent study of blah, 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 right? So I go on and I explain it to you. And the same thing with the fourth one, right? Coffee can be good for your health. And then I talk about sciencey stuff as well. And then I write my little conclusion. And in my conclusion, there we go. In my conclusion, I say this. I say basically the exact same thing I said in my introduction. As I have demonstrated to you, hopefully, because coffee is delicious and inexpensive and because it will help you study and get better grades and is good for your health, all students should drink coffee. And then maybe I come up with some sort of fancy way or funny way to end it or something, right? But there we go. I had a little argument. It was pretty simple. I could definitely write you a paper on that based on using my argument as kind of a framework and then just kind of building it out, right? And so I know, for instance, that in paragraph 1, what's going to go in there? Well, evidence about how delicious coffee is, right? I don't know what I would find. Maybe I would find surveys or taste tests or, you know, what people have said or something like that. That's what would go in that paragraph. I know what I'm looking for that paragraph. Same with the second one. I'm looking for financial data, right? I'm looking for numbers or graphs that show how inexpensive coffee is, right? And so because I've kind of structured it this way, I know what goes in every paragraph. I know what I'm arguing. I know what my thesis statement is. Everything is there. I've just got to fill it in, right? I've got the skeleton. I just have to kind of fill in the rest. And so, again, if you know what your argument is, then you can very easily structure your paper. And it's very, I'm not going to say it's easy to write, but at least it's easier not to get lost, right? And I think we've all done this. If you don't start out with some sort of outline or argument, you start typing away, and then you get half or 3/4 of a page in, and then you're just like, oh God, okay, what now? What do I say now? Who has done that? We've all done it, right? We've all started typing, and then we're like, oh, now what? Now what do I say, right? You're stuck because you don't have a roadmap. You don't know where you're going. And if you can do something like this, you know where you're going, right? You know what's coming first, what's coming second. You know what's supposed to be in every paragraph if you can find it. And you know what to include, right? So say one of my premises here are coffee is delicious, right? And so my first paragraph is supposed to be, this is my topic sentence. Coffee is widely regarded as the world's most popular and delicious drink. What if I can't find any evidence of that? What if I can't find anything to prove to you how delicious coffee is? What do I do? Huh? Take it out, junk it, right? Clearly, it might be a good premise, right? It's a logical support for my conclusion, but if there's no evidence for it, maybe I should get rid of it, right? So again, if something doesn't help my argument, or if I can't find anything to say about it, I'll get rid of it, right? And I'll go with just my other three. So again, if you have a little outline, then again, you know where you're going and you know what the point of your paper is. You know that at the end, you're going to get to the point where you say, and because of all of this, because of I've explained all of this to you, students should drink coffee, or we should definitely see Trump as a fascist, or not, or whatever. Okay? Does that make sense? Is that helpful in any way? Is that helpful? Is that the way you do it, Amanda? Yeah, most times. Yeah, so again, if you can figure out your argument, if you can figure out what you're trying to say at the very beginning, it becomes much easier to write the rest of it, and you don't get lost in the process. And I think, again, all of us have done that. We've sat down to write with no outline, and we pound out a couple of paragraphs, and then we're like, okay, now what? Where am I? What am I writing? What am I supposed to say next, right? And you don't know because you haven't organized it at first, okay? Okay, break time? Okay, let's take a break and we'll come back in 10. Okay, people, and we're back. So, as I mentioned, what I'll do now is I think I've said the things that I needed to say. And so what I will do is I will let you go and let you start working on this, just to give you some class time to do it. The lecture slides I just went through, I'll post them on Student Portal right now. So if you want to look back at them, you can see them very easily. I'll post my little coffee paper outline in Microsoft Teams if it helps you out. I don't know if it will or not, but I'll post it, and then I'll let you get to work. Okay. So, yeah, use the 2 articles that we've already read. Find a 3rd one, and then create your argument, and then you can start writing. Okay. So, online people, I'll let you go. The lecture slides will be in Student Portal in just 2 minutes, and I'll put my coffee outline in Microsoft Teams for you as well in case you need it. So I'll let you go. Have a good rest of the morning.